You thought it was going to be another cat video. So listen, no, tonight is my big night. As in, like, I've done all 10 lessons on my blog. And tonight is the last guided reading of the new Jim Crow. I'm using Teaching Tolerance. And we're going over the new Jim Crow. And I have the book somewhere to show you. What did I do with it? No. Oh, here it is. I had it marked. Going over the new Jim Crow. Woohoo! And tonight it is lesson 10 on my blog. And let me put my footnotes in the bottom of this because my computer's going to die. So I usually just kind of like speed read. Well, I try not to speed read because everybody knows that I talk fast and that can be non-conducive to you understanding what I'm saying. So, lesson 10. Okay, so lesson 6 was not read by the author, but some nice gentleman has taken it upon himself to read it for you. So, if you go to my blog, which is on that link, then you can see the entire audio, but it's like 2 hours, so keep in mind. But if you got a long drive or a commute in the morning, just pop it on. So, and then I've got all the other lessons on there. And then also tomorrow morning or tonight, one or the other, I'm going to have all of them in succession with the lessons. So, and this is my last guided reading. And I'm going to jump right into it. So, I'm using Teaching Tolerance, their lesson plan for the new Jim Crow. And, John, I swear to God, do not say anything hateful. So anyway, Teaching Tolerance. This is a new Jim Crow. And I'm just like, this is like chapter 6 boiled down. And I thought that a couple of these points were super pertinent. And it usually takes me like 30 minutes. So I just kind of like go through it. So, and I use these live videos to save and embed on my blog. Because it's easier than just trying to have all that memory space. The fire this time. Shortly after sunrise on September 20th, 2007, more than 10,000 protesters had already descended on Jena, Louisiana, a small town of about 3,000 people. Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and Martin Luther King III were among those who traveled hundreds of miles to participate in what was heralded as the beginnings of a new civil rights movement. National news media swarmed the town. Cameras rolled at thousands of protesters from all over the country that poured into the rural community and condemned the attempt of murder charges filed against 6 black teenagers who allegedly beat a white classmate at a local high school. I also thought this was also very pertinent for today's times and ages, and especially since it happened on September 20th, which is this month, and then, you know, because history is just a big old circle that repeats itself. This was no ordinary schoolyard fight. Many believe the attack was related to a string of racially charged conflicts and controversies at the school, most notably the hanging of nooses from a tree in the school's main courtyard. The uprising on behalf of the 6 black teens paid off. Although the prosecutor refused to back down from his decision to bring adult charges against the youth, an appellate court ultimately ruled the teens had been tried as juveniles, and many of the charges were reduced or dropped. While this result undoubtedly cheered the thousands of Jena 6 supporters around the country, the spectacle may have been oddly unsettling to parents of children imprisoned for far less serious crimes, including those locked up for minor drug offenses. Where were the prosecutors and civil rights leaders when their children were tried as adults and carted off to adult prisons? Why the outpouring of support and promises of a new civil rights movement on behalf of Jena youth, but not their children? If there had been no nooses hanging from a schoolyard, there would have been no Jena 6, no mass protests, no live coverage on CNN. It was this relic, the news, showing up on so brazenly and leading to a series of racially charged conflicts and controversies that made it possible for the news media and the country as a whole to entertain the possibility that these 6 youths may well have been treated to Jim Crow justice. Ironically, it was precisely this framing that ensured that the events of Jena would not actually launch a new civil rights movement. A new civil rights movement cannot be organized around the relics of an earlier system of control. If we are to address meaningfully the racial reality, if it is to address meaningfully the racial realities of our time. Sorry, I got tongue-tied. Any racial justice movement, to be successful, must vigorously challenge the public consensus that underlines the prevailing system of control. Nooses, racial slurs, and overt bigotry are widely condemned by people across the political spectrum. They are understood to be remnants of the past, no longer reflective of the prevailing public consensus about race. Challenging these forms of racism is certainly necessary, as we must always remain vigilant, but it will do little to shake the foundations of the current system of control. The new caste system, unlike its predecessors, is officially colorblind. We must deal with it on our own terms. Rethinking denial. Or where are civil rights advocates when you need them? What is most striking about the civil rights community response to the mass incarceration of people of color is relatively quiet, given the magnitude, the sheer scale of the new Jim Crow. One would suspect that the war on drugs would be the top priority of every civil rights organization in the country. Conferences, strategy sessions, and debates regarding how best to build a movement to dismantle the new caste system would be occurring on a regular basis. Major grassroots organizing efforts would be underway in nearly every state and city nationwide. All that could have happened, but it didn't. Why not? Going over teaching tolerance lesson plan for the new Jim Crow. Guided lesson 10, chapter 6. All the information is on my blog. A bit of and footnotes to things for you to research are also in the comments. A bit of civil rights history may be helpful here. Throughout most of our nation's history, from the days of abolitionist movement through the civil rights movement, racial justice advocacy has generally revolved around grassroots organizing and the strategic mobilization of public opinion. In recent years, however, a bit of mythology has sprung up regarding the centrality of litigation to racial justice struggles. The success of the brilliant legal crusade that led to Brown versus Board of Education has created a widespread perception that civil rights lawyers are the most important players in racial justice advocacy. As public attention shifted from the streets to the courtroom, the extraordinary grassroots movement that made civil rights legislation possible faded from public view. With all deliberate speed, civil rights organizations became professionalized. I think we call that establishment now. And increasingly disconnected from the communities they claim to represent. Widespread preoccupation with litigation, however, is not the only or even the main reason civil rights groups have shied away from challenging the new caste system. Challenging mass incarceration requires something civil rights advocates have long been reluctant to do: advocacy on behalf of criminals. The politics of respectability has influenced civil rights litigation and advocacy, leading even the most powerful civil rights organizations to distance themselves from the most stigmatized elements of the community, especially lawbreakers. Advocates have found they are most successful when they draw attention to certain types of black people, those who are easily understood by mainstream whites as good and respectable, and tell certain types of stories about them. A prime example is the Rosa Parks story. Rosa Parks was not the first person to refuse to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Civil rights advocates considered and rejected 2 other black women as plaintiffs when planning a test case challenging segregation practices: Claudette Colvin, Colvin, and Mary Louise Smith. Civil rights advocates declined to use Claudette Colvin as a plaintiff because she got pregnant by an older man shortly after her arrest. Ooh. Likewise, they decided not to use Mary Louise Smith as a plaintiff because her father was rumored to be an alcoholic. Most people who are caught up in the criminal justice system have less than flawless backgrounds. The new caste system labels black and brown men as criminals early, often in their teens, making them damaged goods for the perspective of traditional civil rights advocates. With criminal records, the majority of young black men in urban areas are not seen as attractive plaintiffs for civil rights litigation or good for poster boys for media advocacy. We can continue to ignore those labeled criminals in our litigation and media advocacy and focus public attention on more attractive plaintiffs. But if we do so, we should labor under no delusion that we will end mass incarceration. We should labor under no illusion that we will end mass incarceration or shake the foundation of the current racial order. We must face the realities of the new caste system and embrace those who are most pressed by it, if we hope to end the new Jim Crow. Tinkering is for mechanics, not racial justice advocates. If we become serious about dismantling the system of mass incarceration, we must end the war on drugs. There is no way around it. The drug war is largely responsible for the prison boom and the creation of the new undercaste. There is no path to liberation for communities of color that includes this ongoing war. Ending the drug war cannot be accomplished through a landmark court decision, an executive order, or a single stroke of a presidential pen. Since 1982, the war has raged like a forest fire set with a few matches and a gallon of gasoline. What began as an audacious federal program has spread to every state in the nation and nearly every city. It has infected law enforcement activities on the roads, sidewalks, highways, train stations, airports, and the nation's border. The war has effectively shredded portions of the U.S. Constitution, eliminating Fourth Amendment protections once deemed the war has effectively shredded portions of the U.S. Constitution, including the Fourth Amendment. That's like the illegal search. That was on a few chapters back. And it has marginalized policing practices in inner cities across America. A flawed public consensus lies at the core of the prevailing caste system. When people think about crime, especially drug crime, they do not think about suburban housewives violating laws regulating prescription drugs or white frat boys using ecstasy. Drug crime in this country is understood to be black and brown, and it is because drug crime is racially defined in the public consciousness that the electorate has not cared much what happens to drug criminals, at least not the way they would have cared if the criminals were understood to be white. Brock Turner, or anything else that's going on right now, or how they took that little white kid after he went into that church and shot all those people. They took him to Burger King after they arrested him. And he's still alive today. He didn't get gunned down in the street. At least not the way they would have cared if the criminals were understood to be white. It is this failure to really care across color lines that lies at the core of the system of control and racial caste system that has existed in the United States, that has existed in the United States. In the absence of a fundamental shift in public consciousness, the system as a whole will remain intact. To the extent that major changes are achieved without a complete shift, the system will rebound. The caste system will reemerge in a new form, just as convict leasing replaced slavery. It will be reborn just as mass incarceration replaced Jim Crow. Let's talk about race. Resisting the temptation of colorblind advocacy. The author defines colorblindness, and I agree with her, is if you're colorblind, you believe that race doesn't matter. And that would be great if we didn't live in a society where there were racial laws that were built on race. So you might be fine and dandy and you might see that way, but can you get over here and help everybody who doesn't see it that way get what we need accomplished done? So any movement to end mass incarceration must deal with mass incarceration as a racial caste system, not a system of crime control. That is not to say that crime is unimportant. It is very important. We need an effective system of crime prevention and control in our communities. But that is not what the current system is. The system is better designed to create crime and a perpetual class of people labeled criminals rather than to eliminate crime or reduce the number of criminals. I talk too fast and I get tongue-tied. My mother told me I need to fix that, and I'm almost 30. I probably should. All I can think of is my mother. You talk too fast. We need to talk about race openly and honestly. People must come to understand the racial history and origins of mass incarceration, the many ways our conscious and unconscious biases have distorted our judgments over the years about what is fair, appropriate, and constructive when responding to drug use and drug crime. We must come to see, too, how our economic insecurities and racial resentments have been exploited for political gain, and how this manipulation has caused suffering for people of all colors. Finally, we must admit out loud that it was because of race that we didn't care much what happened to those people and imagined the worst possible things about them. Admittedly, the temptation to ignore race in our advocacy may be overwhelming. Race makes people uncomfortable. One study found that some whites are so loath to talk about race and so fearful of violating racial etiquette that they indicate a preference for avoiding all contact with black people. That's apparently footnote 2. The striking reluctance of whites in particular to talk about or even acknowledge race has led many scholars to advocates to conclude that we would be better off not talking about race at all. That's wrong. That last part was my opinion. Even if fairly drastic changes were achieved while ignoring race, the results would be highly contingent and temporary. States would likely gravitate back to their old ways if a new, more compassionate... States would likely gravitate back to their old ways if a new, more compassionate public consensus about race had not been forged. The criminalization and demonization of black men is one habit America seems unlikely to break without addressing head-on the racial dynamics that have given rise to successive caste systems. Although colorblind approaches to addressing the problems of poor people of color often seem pragmatic and short-term, in the long run they are counterproductive. Colorblindness, though widely touted as the solution, is actually the problem. Against colorblindness. The public consensus supporting mass incarceration is officially colorblind. It purports to see black and brown men not as black and brown, but simply as men, raceless men, who have failed miserably to play by the rules the rest of us follow quite naturally. The fact that so many brown and black men are rounded up for drug crimes that go largely ignored when committed by whites is unseen. Our collective colorblindness prevents us from seeing this basic fact. We have become blind not so much to race, but to the existence of a racial caste in America. More than 45 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. warned of this danger. He insisted that blindness and an indifference to racial groups is actually more important than racial hostility to the creation and maintenance of racialized systems of control. Those who support slavery and Jim Crow, he argued, simply were not bad or evil people. They were just blind. Could not the same speech be given about mass incarceration today? Again, African Americans have been crucified by conscientious blindness. People of goodwill have been unwilling to see black and brown men in their humanness as entitled to the same care, compassion, and concern that would be extended to one's friends, neighbors, or loved ones. Racial indifference and blindness, far more than racial hostility, form the sturdy foundation for all racial caste systems. If colorblindness is such a bad idea, though, why have people across a political spectrum become so attached to it? For conservatives, the ideal of colorblindness is linked to a commitment to individualism. Gross racial disparities in health, wealth, education, and opportunity should be of no interest to our government, and racial identity should be a private matter, something best kept to ourselves. For liberals, the ideal of colorblindness is linked to the dream of racial equality, the hope that is one day we will no longer see race because race will lose all of its significance. In this fantasy, eventually race will no longer be a factor in mortality rates, the spread of disease, education, and economic opportunity, or the distribution of wealth. Seeing race is not the problem. Refusing to care for people we see is the problem. The fact that the meaning of race may evolve over time or lose much of its significance is hardly a reason to be struck blind. We should hope not for a colorblind society, but instead for a world in which we can see each other fully, learn from each other, and do what we can to respond to each other with love. That was King's dream. A society that is capable of seeing each of us as we are with love. That is the goal worth fighting for. All of us are none. Oh, we've heard that chant. I think she wrote this book in 2010, but we've just heard this all or none chant when they were talking about DACA. Taking our cue from courageous civil rights. I don't know. I just sing chants being reused. Taking our cue from the courageous civil rights advocates who brazenly refuse to define them, Taking our cue from the courageous civil rights advocates who brazenly refuse to defend themselves, marching unarmed past white mobs that threaten to kill them, we too must be the change we hope to create. If we want to do more than just end mass incarceration, if we want to put an end to the history of racial caste in America, we must lay down our racial bribes, join hands with people of all colors who are not content to wait for change to trickle down, and say to those who would stand in our way, except all of us are none. That is the basic message that Martin Luther King Jr. aimed to deliver through the Poor People's Movement back in 1968. He argued then that the time had come for radical justice advocates to shift from civil rights to human rights paradigm, and that the real work of movement building had only just begun. A human rights approach, he believed, would offer far greater hope for those of us determined to create a thriving multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy free from racial hierarchy than the civil rights model had previously provided. It would offer a positive vision of what we can strive for, a society in which all human beings of all races are treated with dignity and have the right to food, shelter, healthcare, and education. Food, shelter, healthcare, education, and security. Footnote 4 in the comments. More than 40 years later, civil rights advocacy is stuck in a model of advocacy King was determined to leave behind. Rather than challenging the basic structure of society and doing the hard work of movement building, the work to which King was still committed to at the end of his life, we have been tempted too often by the opportunity for people of color to be included within the political and economic structure as is, even if it means alienating those who are necessary allies. We have allowed ourselves to be willingly blind to the emergence of a new caste system, a system of social excommunication that has denied millions of African Americans basic human dignity. The significance of this cannot be overstated, for the failure to acknowledge the humanity and dignity of all persons has lurked at the root of every racial caste system. If Martin Luther King Jr. is right that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, a new movement will rise, and if civil rights organizations fail to keep up with the times, they will be pushed to the side as another generation of advocates come to the fore. Hopefully the new generation will be led by those who know best that the brutality of the new caste system, a group with greater vision, courage, and determination than the old guard can muster, trapped as they may be in an outdated paradigm. This new generation of activists should not disrespect their elders or disparage their contributions or achievements. To the contrary, they should bow their heads in respect, for the forerunners have extended untold hours and made great sacrifices in an elusive quest for justice. But once respects have been paid, they should also march right past them, emboldened, as King once said, by the fierce urgency of now. I like that part. I need to highlight that later. Those of us who hope to be their allies should not be surprised if and when this day comes, that when those who have been locked up and locked out finally have the chance to speak and truly be heard, that what we hear is rage. The rage may frighten us. It may remind us of riots, uprisings, and buildings aflame. We may be tempted to control it or to douse it with buckets of doubt, dismay, and disbelief. But we should do no such thing. Instead, when a young man who is born in the ghetto and who knows little of life beyond the walls of his prison cell and the invisible cage that has become his life turns to us in bewilderment and rage, we should do nothing more than look him in the eye and tell him the truth. We should tell him the same truth great African-American writer James Baldwin told his nephew in a letter published in 1962. In one of the most extraordinary books ever written, The Fire Next Time. With great passion and searing conviction, Baldwin had this to say to his young nephew. This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them. That they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, and do not know it, and do not want to know it. It is their innocence which constitutes the crime. This innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity, and in as many ways as possible, that you were a worthless human being. But those men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality, and begin to change it. We can make America what it must become. Footnote 5, and I'm going to put that on my blog. I'm going to go put that on my blog. So, the lesson is on my blog, I should have linked it to it. There is a vocabulary list tonight, and the definitions are up. If you've missed any previous lessons, they're all on there. And I have got all the vocabulary words that we do while we're going over the books. I just go ahead and put them on the glossary. Thank you. Oh, lesson 10. We did the first whole book. Yay!